cannot understand how they possibly arranged for them to have that in the rain. It's a funny thing. It's a bit like launching an election campaign when you're 20% behind and imagining it's going to change. Maybe they thought he wouldn't get wet if he went out in the rain. I can't quite understand the thinking behind it. The rest of those things are exactly what I mean. They are pure narrative.
Yes, here we are again then. It's how to win an election. Now we're actually in an election. I'm Matt Chorley, joined as ever by our election winners and sometimes losers. It is Daniel Finkelstein, Peter Mandelson and Polly Mackenzie. Now, we last gathered for our emergency episode. Thanks to all the people who've listened to that and been in touch. Let's kick off with a question from James in London. If you were running this Tory campaign, would you have two strategies? Strategy 1, how to win this election, or strategy 2, damage limitation for after this election? And at what point might you ditch strategy 1? Danny, so far, does it look like Rishi Sunak is trying to win this election?
Yeah, he is obviously going to try and do that, but I think he'll be very realistic about the chances of doing it. In fact, he's been quite realistic even before he went into Downing Street in the first place because of what had happened with Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. There is an interesting question that's being posed here, which is, given that everybody is of the view that the Conservative Party won't win the election, would you be better starting on a strategy of saying we've got to make sure that Labour doesn't win a huge majority? Would you be better doing that? Nobody ever does that. And that good reason is that it creates a bandwagon effect against you. People like to be it'll make it even worse, the situation where people think the Conservatives are losing. It might have the advantage you look as though you're in control of the circumstances. It's quite a difficult call, that. I'm sure they won't make that call. Lots of MPs, after all, can win their individual fights, and they won't want the government at the centre to look as though it's given up.
But at the heart of the question is about what does the Conservative Party look like after polling day? And, we've talked a lot of times about the fact that Rishi Sunak, if he goes too far to the sort of reform side, he might lose his southeastern sort of core true blue Tory seats. But equally, if he tacks to the centre, he might keep those seats, but then he'll lose those red wall seats. So part of the strategy, I think you could decide which arm do you want to chop off. And if you cared about the future of the Conservative Party, you might decide that maybe you want to pull it back to being more like the traditional One Nation Tories who, by no means consistently, but are more likely to be in those more traditional safe seats. That doesn't seem to be what they are doing. It seems to me, in as much as there is a strategy so far, it is to appeal much more to the sort of, the reform traditionalist, older voter, and not to think about how do you sort of sound economically credible and how do you talk to like affluent people in the southeast.
I think we're in danger of overthinking all this. Look, they're hanging on for grim death. That's what they're doing. As it happens, I think they've got off to not an unreasonable start. I'll come back to that in a moment. But of course, you fight an election to win. That sort of governs everything that you say and do. But we also know that the size of the defeat, if defeat it is going to be, will determine what happens in the Conservative Party next. If it's a huge defeat, then I think that will, empower all those who want to crucify Sunak and everything that he's done in office. It will embolden the right. It will sort of propel the sort of Faragists in the Conservative Party. And that will determine what happens in that party over the next sort of few years. Who's going to be the leader, what strategy they adopt, what sort of character of party they're going to become, and therefore how effectively or not they're going to be able to oppose the Labour government. And that will determine in turn, what happens at the following election. So the size of the defeat, if it is going to be a defeat, is very, very important. All I was going to say, counterintuitively perhaps, is that I don't think they've got off to a disastrous start. I think Labour's got off to a good start, very polished, very professional and fine, and good vibe from Starmer this morning in his speech. But if the point of an election campaign is to be noticed and to have what you say talked about, then this national service thing is being talked about by the public. I mean, they've gone from a position where they were being completely ignored, everyone had tuned out, to a position where at least people are talking about what they're saying, even if they're not applauding it.
No, I really agree with you, Peter. Look, I think that they've done two things in the first few days, both of which are linked to the strategy of calling the election earlier. One of which is to catch Nigel Farage on the hop. Let's assume, and you can't assume this completely, but let's assume we can take him at face value. It does seem to have pushed him out the race. It does seem to have pushed him out the race. Certainly, it'll caught reform. I mean, admittedly, it's caught everyone a little bit by surprise in terms of candidate selection, but that's more of a problem for reform. So if you wanted to do that, that's been achieved. And the second thing is they're trying to demonstrate against this time for a change feeling. They've still got things to say that are new and surprising, and they've managed to do that. Now, as it happens, I think a lot of people will have doubts about the policy they've announced, and there's the question about whether it's aimed at the right people, which is what Polly suggested. But there is a kind of, I think we have to be careful as we're commenting through this election on this narrative approach, which is the Tories are going to lose, thus everything that they do is hapless. That isn't actually the case. I think it'll be extremely difficult for anything they do to make much of a difference to the outcome for reasons that I've, spoken about at great length on previous podcasts. But given the range of things that they're trying to do, calling an election, doing catching Nigel Farage on the hop, announcing a policy that captures attention, insofar as you think any of that will make any difference, those things are all things that a campaign would wish to do. And so therefore, let's put aside what admittedly was a pretty surprisingly bad introduction to the campaign, the rain fiasco.
Well, I was going to say that, Danny. You said it has not everything they've done has been hapless. He got soaked when he made the announcement. He went to Wales and asked them if they were looking forward to the football in a tournament they're not in.
No.
He then went to the Titanic shipyard, and then an exact thing that we talked about on the podcast last week, posed under an exit sign for photos on an aeroplane.
So what I would say to that is the first one of those is a real thing, right? I cannot understand how they possibly arranged for them to have that in the rain. It's a funny thing. It's a bit like launching an election campaign when you're 20% behind and imagining it's going to change. Maybe they thought he wouldn't get wet if he went out in the rain. I can't quite understand the thinking behind it. The rest of those things are exactly what I mean. They are pure narrative. I made the point that John Major visited a Formula One car factory, and the story was that the wheels have gone off the Tory campaign. Going to Wales and talking to people about football is totally not a ridiculous thing unless you are looking for things to say were terrible. Nor was visiting whatever that place was that I can't even remember that you mentioned.
The Titanic shipyard?
Those are the visit shipyard is perfectly reasonable. And if Keir Starmer had visited it, nobody would have commented on it. So I'm just saying it's extremely important not to add narrative, just as I objected to it when it was done to Ed Miliband and his sandwich. So I'm not trying to make a partisan point. It's a point about how we cover the campaign, really.
And let's not spend our time commenting on the commentary of the media.
Polly.
But it's so much fun. I'm sort of desperate to talk about the policy, actually, because it was really fascinating, as somebody who spent a lot of time, a lot of general elections, writing those detailed policy briefs to get in front of your ministers and your spokespeople. It felt very PTSD-ish seeing this thing fall apart, because what you've got is dozens of different people asking questions in different media outlets, and nobody knows what on earth is going on. That happened to us with the mansion tax, particularly because Vince Cable made it up without telling anyone he was going to announce it. And so suddenly you're trying to catch up. And people are asking questions, all pretty sensible questions. And it's why actually doing your homework on your policies is just really important. It's it's kind of risk mitigation. Danny talks a lot about how none of this noise matters because it's leadership that matters. And that's true. But what is the context in which you have to exert your leadership? Is it a context where you look like a bit of a shambles because nobody understands your policy because you didn't actually think about the details and you tried to fob us off with a royal commission? Actually, the amount of muscle you need to exert on that leadership is so much harder, which means it distracts you from being able to focus on your message to the voters. Nevertheless, despite the fact that I think this policy announcement was just from a sort of technical standpoint bungled, I think they genuinely are onto something, and it makes me very sad to see it sort of messed up in this way. Not particularly about like hustling 18-year-olds into the military. My children have told me very clearly that I'm not allowed to vote Conservative because they don't want to join the army, but actually because we are in a situation where, you know, that the model which says that there's a complete dividing line between sort of business and the social economy, what happens in the public sector and public services. And businesses pay their taxes and then the taxpayer just pays for everything else, is breaking down in the face of demographic change and also in what's called Baumol's cost disease, which basically just means that as the economy gets more productive, care work, which can't be automated really, gets more and more comparatively expensive. And so actually this idea that we need to blur the boundaries between the official state and the voluntary state is incredibly important. It's not really a general election-y sort of a thing. It's something that actually David Cameron talked about in 2010 in terms of the big society. And it makes my heart bleed really to think that there are clever people still within this Conservative Party who are thinking the right thoughts about how you might make our country work. And yet for 14 years to show for that, they've made no progress on any of that.
I don't want to trivialise anything that Polly. I don't want to trivialise anything that Polly has said. I broadly agree with what she said, but I, however, think we're missing one fundamental thing, and that is with the start of this campaign, with Sunak having called the election early, most of the public, I think, will have drawn the conclusion that the reason he's going early is because there's bad news on its way. That if there was better news on the economy, better news on boats and migration, he would have waited till the autumn. And the reason why this is important is because his whole campaign is about, you know, the plan, finishing the plan, continuing the plan, turning the corner. I think people will now suspect every time they hear him talk about the plan that the plan has failed, that the reason he's gone early is because he didn't want that to become startlingly obvious in the autumn, and therefore actually they're going to find it incredibly irritating to keep hearing him talking about the plan when he knows it's not going to, when he already knows it's not going to produce any success. That's, I think, a fundamental observation.
I hope it does, because Labour's got the same plan.
So on Labour then, let's move on to Labour, because one contrast we can draw, I think, from the first few days of the campaign is that the Tories have got some things to announce, and people have been taking the mickey out of them, saying they haven't been working. We've even got government ministers like Steve Baker saying he's not even on board, but people are talking about a Tory idea. So far as we can tell, thus far, Labour's plan is to hold up a sign with the word change on it, and Keir Starmer tell everyone he completely understands that nobody knows anything about him, while not necessarily setting out a plan of his own, Peter.
Well, I think change is very important for two reasons. One, it's change from the Tories, because people are fed to the back teeth with them and feel very angry. And secondly, it's change from Corbyn. Starmer can't win unless he demonstrates convincingly he's changed from both. Changed from the economic sort of chaos of the Tories and changed from the lack of patriotism and feeling for his country of Corbyn. So when he talks about, you know, putting country, you know, before party, he's saying those two things, both about his opponents and about his ex-leader who's not even going to fight for this election. What he's got to do, and he's got off to a reasonable start doing it in my view, is first of all introduce himself, because a lot of people, according to all the polls, don't know enough about him, who he is, where he comes from and what's important to him, and that was clearly what he was doing in his speech this morning. But secondly, he's got to demonstrate convincingly who is important to him. When he makes policy choices as Prime Minister, who will he have in his mind as he does so. And the people he's got to have in his mind are the have-nothings, the have-somethings, and the people who want more, therefore. And people have got to be absolutely convinced that those are the people that he's going to have in his mind. They're the bulk, overwhelming mass of people who are going to be voting in this election. He's got to persuade the doubters amongst them that he can, provide demonstrable change. And that's what he's got, 6 weeks? It seems like an eternity, but that's what he's got 6 weeks to achieve.
Polly, is it?
Sorry,
Sorry, Danny. Let me just ask Polly, because there's an interesting thing there, though, Polly. That the Tories clearly have identified, as we've seen in polling and in focus groups, that it is a weakness of Keir Starmer's that people say they don't know anything about him. They don't know what he stands for. They've called a snap election. They spent the last 4 days. There's been like sort of Tory social media accounts posting how many hours it's been since he's been seen, what's he doing, what's he saying. And if every night on the the broadcast news where everyone has to get their bit, Rishi Sunak just keeps saying he's taking the public for fools and nobody knows what he stands for, while he's also not setting out any concrete policies, that there is a risk there for him, isn't there?
I think there is, and it's what the Conservatives are doing best, right? You really can see some message consistency. Even all of Rishi Sunak's Twitter threads are 6 tweets long. I don't know if that's been particularly focused groups, but nevertheless, he really going into, let me explain, and these sort of. But what's weird about it is, oh my God, can I remember it? Clear plan, bold action, secure future. And with all these little arrows, it's like a sort of process map for a piece of software. It's very unappealing, I think, in comparison to this simple word change. And, we are right at the beginning of an election campaign. It's been the first weekend. So if Keir Starmer only says change for 6 weeks, I think that risk does start to crystallise. But there is a sort of, there's an ebb and flow to an election campaign. You start out with simple clarity. And the Conservatives are offering one message, which has got 6 words in it. And the Labour Party is offering one message which has got 1 word in it. I think that's just better. But they can't hold that for 6 weeks. They do need to come forward with more substance, more action. My assumption is that they've got some fuel in the tank for that. Of course, the manifesto launch. I mean, you remember that in 2017, actually, it's a manifesto launch that really kind of gave some, partly because it got leaked, but a kind of huge sort of rocket for the Labour campaign, which, I'm sure Danny says it doesn't matter, but felt like it mattered within the sort of Westminster bubble, at least, for people's kind of sense of momentum.
So I think that the Labour Party campaign, which I know that both of you objected a little bit when I satirised it like this, but this is Britain's broken. Don't let's do anything about it. That both those aspects are very, as I said last time, a very good electoral strategy. And the question is whether or not Keir Starmer can hold his nerve on it all the way to election day. I think it's really important for him that he not be pulled into making a lot of exciting statements. This doesn't mean we haven't learned something about his direction. He is essentially the most impressive and important thing that he has done is remove Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party and move the Labour Party therefore towards the centre. It isn't obvious what the strategy is for Labour now that isn't what the Conservatives are broadly doing, given that they're now no longer a socialist party and they're no longer a working class party. So the origin of this not being quite clear what they're doing doesn't originate with Keir Starmer. But I think people probably do perceive that if they elected a Labour government, it would govern differently to the Conservatives in certain ways, and certainly that it wouldn't be as unstable. And that actually means that this message, if he can hold the balance of it and hold his nerve under the Conservative attack, it's obvious that you would attack this, that will be quite appealing. So although it sounds like satire, I think it's actually a reasonable description of a fairly ruthless strategy.
And actually, I suppose the key test will come where if and when there's a wobble, that there's a narrowing in the polls or Labour have a wobble, at that point does Labour hold its nerve, Peter?
Well, of course there's going to be a wobble. I mean, the media, blessed media commentary, which I hope we can avoid commenting on, will decide at some point that these runaway winners, the runaway victors of the Labour Party, have now sort of suddenly slipped. They've dropped the ball. They've done something wrong. Can the Conservative Party seize the advantage and suddenly race off towards the finishing line? So you're going to get that at some stage during the campaign, and they certainly have to keep their nerve. I mean, it's just as sure as night follows day, that is what is going to happen. But just to offer one postscript to what Polly and Danny have said, essentially, Labour and Starmer have got to move from change to change that the voters can believe in. So I think they've got change. The public's absolutely furious that, they're not better off, that they haven't got a dentist, they can't see a doctor, the migration isn't falling, and they can't afford to buy a home. So they've got change, the need for change, but that's not necessarily yet change that I, the voter, can believe in. And therefore, what Labour has got to do during this long campaign is to establish a whole series of proof points, if you like, starting with the manifesto, but it doesn't end with the manifesto. It begins with the manifesto, and then through those 5 missions, they've got to clearly demonstrate and persuade people of those proof points of change that people can believe in and then vote for.
So, as a result of everything Peter said, I now have the 2010 Liberal Democrat theme tune in my head. Change that works for you.
We'll try and see if I'll see if I can. See if I can find it before the end of the episode.
No, not again. No.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned. We'll see if we can find it. We'll move
I can
on. We'll
sing
come
it
back
if you
to
like.
candidates.
No, please don't.
We're going to talk candidates because right now there's a rush on to try and select candidates in time for July the 5th. I just want to end this part of the podcast, though, with a quote from Steve Baker. He's the Northern Ireland Minister. He's already cross about the national service policy. It turns out he is now away. He's been speaking to the Daily Mirror from the Sun Lounger, and he's told the Daily Mirror, the Prime Minister told everyone we could go on holiday and then called a snap election. So I've chosen to do my campaign work in Greece. So it's all going very well. It's all going very well.
How pathetic. These people really are so pathetic. Why can't they be more loyal, more professional, and do their jobs properly? Makes me... I mean, I know they're Tories, okay.
But otherwise, Danny and Polly are good colleagues to have. Right, let's move on. Up next, we'll ask, how do you dodge your dodgy candidates? We'll do that next on How to Win an Election. Yes, it's How to Win an Election with me, Matt Chorley, joined as ever by Daniel Finkelstein, Peter Mandelson and Polly Mackenzie. If you would like to get in touch with a question, you can email us howtowin@thetimes.co.uk or WhatsApp 0333 003 2353. Now, the thing I wanted to pick your brains about is the thing that's going on in political parties right now, the rush to select candidates, in part because Rishi Sunak surprised everyone with it. You've all been candidates of various kinds with varying degrees of success. Michael Crick is sort of leading a one-man campaign to keep across everyone's candidate selection. The last time I checked, he was saying the Tories don't have candidates in around 30 seats they currently hold. There are another 150 or so where they don't have candidates as well. Labour, by contrast, have got about a dozen left to pick in where people have suddenly announced they're standing down. There's a couple of targets, target seats which needs them. So once again, Danny, how is it? We'll come to your various experiences being a candidate at the moment. How is it that the only person Rishi Sunak's caught off guard when it comes to candidates is Rishi Sunak?
No, it's not the only. These call all the parties off guard. Look, central offices don't mind late selection of candidates because it gives them some control over the nature of the party. Michael Crick's doing this really excellent journalistic work. I've often felt in previous elections that was really missing because obviously what he's doing is mapping the next parliament. the Conservative Party is going to, I think, through this process, probably choose better candidates than it might choose if it took longer time, because there'll be more of a negotiation between local parties and the centre. But we'll see how that works.
Peter, there seems to be one thing that Labour seem to be doing is rushing a lot of friends of Morgan McSweeney and the NEC into safe seats.
Well, there are a number of late retirees, and so they've got those seats, those candidates got to be filled, and that's done by the NEC in a broadly democratic way, and that's what will happen.
Broadly doing a lot of heavy lifting there, Peter.
Broadly done. Look, I tell you why it's important though, because unlike other countries, in Britain, ministers are drawn exclusively from Parliament, from either one of the two houses of Parliament. That's not the case in other countries, and therefore your candidates and your MPs are really important because they literally are your talent pool, exclusive talent pool for the government. But politically, it's also important. Let's be honest, because going back to proof points, who makes up the next parliamentary Labour Party is the proof that it really has changed. You know, at the moment you have a parliamentary party, Labour MPs, made up of people who were selected and elected during Corbyn and Miliband's time. Now you're going to have overwhelmingly people who've been selected under Keir Starmer, and those are the people who've got to share Keir Starmer's outlook, his view, his approach to politics and policy, and that's overwhelmingly what he's going to get. And therefore, these late selections in seats that we already hold become very important, not least for that reason.
But then I suppose that it's him. Weirdly, actually, he has less control over the people who are going to be in the seats because they've already been selected. It's the control that the
Are you saying that
might wield.
Sorry, are you saying that Keir Starmer has not been able to exercise any influence in the candidate selection to date?
I just mean using the emergency powers. The emergency powers, yes. Polly, tell us about when you were a candidate.
I mean, I've never stood for Parliament. I'm a wimp. I was only a council candidate, but I was involved in helping to kind of screen candidates for being actual Liberal Democrats. And it's much more difficult in the smaller parties in general because the chances of you getting a job at the end of it are obviously much less. And I know so many Liberal Democrat colleagues, the people I worked with for so long, who put huge amounts of their personal kind of financial health on the line in order to get elected and would work a seat 2 or even 3 times in order to secure a victory. I was in Eastbourne. I actually did some door knocking this weekend. Get a proper election vibe. It was in Eastbourne, which was won by a guy called Stephen Lloyd, who had a weird thing about a giant bee costume. I don't know, but just sort of massively, massively loved in Eastbourne because he had he worked that seat and worked that seat and worked that seat. And the new candidate is a guy called Josh Babarinde, who worked for Stephen, who has been out campaigning since he was 16. And that level of dedication, and that's when you might win a seat. Equally, there are 600 other seats, which the Liberal Democrats have no expectation of winning. For the Greens, 648 seats, it goes on and on, where you kind of want to put forward a candidate and you're really trying to just beg, cajole, encourage people who are, but they still can't be people who will embarrass or humiliate you, because it doesn't matter if that person is likely to get 1% of the votes. If they turn out to be a wrong 'un, then that is enough for you to be, sort of hauled over the coals in the newspapers and on the radio for it.
And as they have been, I think every party has had some people already had to stand out. Danny, what about you when you were a candidate? You were a candidate twice, weren't you?
I was, yeah. So Roy Jenkins encouraged me to be a candidate when I was 23 years old, because he said he'd run for Parliament himself very young. And I went on the campaign trail, and I've got a letter at home from the Citizens Advice Bureau, which says, "Dear Mr. Finkelstein, we were so pleased to meet you, and your mother." Because I was very young, absurdly young, in a seat that, to be fair, the SDP Liberal Alliance wasn't expecting to win. I fought Ken Livingstone in that election, which was quite an interesting thing to do. And then I fought again. I fought for the Conservatives in Harrow in 2001, and that was interesting because that was a seat with a lot of a big immigrant population, which has now moved towards the Conservatives somewhat. That area and that group, which is the Hindu population, but in that election was still voting Labour. And then, of course, the Tory campaign was all about asylum and wasn't, I think, particularly aimed at the seat I was running. So I had the sort of fighting. So I had the sort of thing of being involved in a national campaign, and I could see on the ground its local impact, which was very interesting.
And have you ever been a candidate, Peter?
A victorious one, proud of my town. I was both hugely surprised and bowled over when I was selected to fight Hartlepool in 1989. Everyone said to me that it wouldn't happen, it was too difficult, and I always remember, it still sort of hurts me but also emboldens me, 24 hours before I was being selected, facing the members and the trade union delegates in Hartlepool on that Sunday in December in 1989, my leading opponent photocopied a pretty vicious article about me in the News of the World, exposing my terrible, gay infamy for all that could possibly be interested in it. And he photocopied this article in the News of the World and put it in anonymous brown envelopes and posted them through the door of every single party member and trade union delegate 24 hours before the selection, thinking that was going to be the end of me. And of course, the exact opposite. My complete faith in human nature was totally restored because I ran away to a huge first round success, beating him to pulp. Great. It was a very, very, very emotional 24 hours, as I thought I was sort of dead. And then, of course, received this sort of fantastic sort of vindication and support. And there we are. That seems to be the story of my political life.
So you were there as Director of Communication in '87 for Neil Kinnock, but because you weren't still in that job because you were the candidate then in '92, would Labour have won in 1992 if you'd still been running the show?
That is a very, very sore. That puts your finger right on a very, very raw nerve. Thank you very much, Matt, whatever your name is. I've forgotten already. There are still some people who genuinely nurse a sort of grievance against me and think that had I remained at my post and continued to fight as campaign director and not gone off to be selected, in '92 we would have won. That I don't believe is the case. The truth is that whoever was directing that campaign in '92 would have found that we had not changed enough, that we had not restored trust sufficiently in the Labour Party, given everything we went through in the 1980s, and that we still had some way to go. That is not the case now in 2024. I mean, the change is convincing, people are persuaded, and we have a Labour Party that people can trust. But that was not, I'm afraid, despite all Neil Kinnock's Herculean efforts, the case in 1992.
Danny, in a smaller way, there's a similar thing happening right now in the Tory party, because lots of the people around Rishi Sunak in Number 10, including Will Tanner, we've talked about him before, he was supposed to be holding the pen on writing the manifesto, are going off and trying to find seats. Does that present a problem for Rishi Sunak during the campaign if his closest people are then suddenly, out in the rain delivering leaflets?
He'll have been aware of, I'm sure, about Will Tanner's interest in fighting a seat if that's what's going to happen. So those people will have had discussions. They'll have organised their campaign in order to allow that to happen. And indeed, in 2001, George Osborne and I were William Hague's closest advisors. And one of the newspapers described our decision to fight seats as the rats leaving a sinking ship. So when we used to go and campaign in our seats on a Friday, one of our colleagues used to call it the rat's day off. So I'm sort of sympathetic. It's difficult. One of the things that is very difficult as a candidate, is to earn a living and also be a candidate. So there are lots of things that you can't do. For example, you can't be a special advisor and be a candidate. You can't be a civil service and be a candidate. Lots of jobs, insist that you're not a candidate. And people can end up sometimes 2 to 3 years from a general election without being able to earn a living. It can be very, very difficult, and the costs of being a candidate. So actually, one of the best ways of being a candidate is at the last minute to find a seat. Here's a problem though: if you're a special advisor and you get a seat at the last minute, you lose. You even if it's a completely losing seat, and you're only doing it with 2 weeks left or 3 weeks left on your government contract, you then wouldn't get any termination benefits. So it's quite a big fun. Being a candidate involves quite a big financial sacrifice for lots of people on both sides, and it can be quite difficult to navigate. And I know that definitely one of the things that was an issue for me is, well, if I become a candidate, how do I earn a living while I'm a candidate? Who's going to employ me? Considering that I'm a candidate for a political party. And so this is very attractive, this idea of these seats come up at the last minute and you can apply for them. I think the people who do end up getting them, if Will Tanner is one of those people, I think Will Tanner would be an excellent MP, by the way. That's a big advantage for those people.
Polly, is it fair to say that most think tanks only exist as a home for people trying to get seats? I'm just thinking, I think Josh Simon from Labour Together's tipped to get a seat. Obviously, Seb Payne from Onward has been trying to get... lots of people end up sort of in the think tanky world because there's the one place where that bit of overlap is probably okay.
As a former director of a think tank, I think, you have to remember that it's a really diverse sector. There are very politically aligned think tanks. Onward, clearly closely aligned to the Conservative Party. I think both the director and the deputy director would both quite like to find seats. Similarly, IPPR, New Economics Foundation, Mia Tafanbullah from NEF is now a candidate, Campbell and Peckham, I believe. But there's other think tanks that are non-party, that are specialist, looking at a whole range of different things. And I wouldn't want people to think quite as cynically as you, Matt, that the only people with an interest in policy are people who are trying to climb up the greasy pole to get a political seat. It is extremely challenging to get influence or voice within politics in the world of policy, unless you are willing to take sides. And we should respect those who at least try to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
The only postscript I would add is that all the people you've mentioned who do have a genuine interest in and grasp of policy would make rather good MPs and rather good ministers. I mean, Will Tanner, very good. Seb Payne, very good. Josh Simons, very good. I'd like to see other people, say, from the Resolution Foundation or other think tanks coming forward. I think that's quite a good seedbed for future MPs.
Very good, very good. I wasn't being disparaging about anyone. I would never do that. Up next, I want to ask you about your thoughts on Michael Gove departing the political scene. And I might have found the Be the Change music, so that's something to look forward to. We'll do that next on How to Win an Election. Now, we've had quite a lot of correspondence since I emerged, because we did 2 episodes last week. Loads of people got in touch telling Polly and I off for not knowing more about Eric Heffer. A good example that James got in touch saying, although Eric Heffer was a member of the Hard Left, he and Mrs. Thatcher had a good relationship. And she famously crossed the aisle of the House of Commons to shake him by the hand when it was known he was mortally ill with cancer. Other people got in touch to say she went to his memorial service. James says, amidst all the mirth about Eric Heffer, I always thought this was a rather uplifting, even surprising tale. So that's a nice postscript to the Eric Heffer debacle from last week. Peter, there's also you on the emergency episode You wouldn't give us a prediction for what you thought might happen in the election. You said you'd banned people from doing predictions. Alex says Peter was being a tad disingenuous about predicting majorities, or rather, he's all about not predicting them, particularly Labour ones on the emergency episode. I'm old enough to remember Jim Knockerty on the Today programme asking him just before the 1997 election, is it going to be a big one? After a lot of very childish sniggering, Peter replied, I think it will be a very sizable one. So apparently you have previously passed comments, Peter.
Look, size matters.
But he's older now.
Older and wiser. I'm pleased that, to be honest, the childish sniggering from all of that was just confined to me. One of the last couple of things we should talk about: Lucy Allen and Reform, Conservative candidate in Telford, had previously announced she was standing down. She's just announced that she's now backing Reform and is being suspended from the Tory party with only days left as a Conservative MP. A reminder, Danny, that although Nigel Farage isn't standing, Reform will keep being an interesting flavour in this campaign.
Look, ultimately, and I think Polly made this point earlier, the Conservative Party is going to have something of a choice as to which groups it wants to be inside the tent. But in a general election campaign, you clearly want discipline, you clearly want everyone on side. I'm sure one of the reasons why Rishi Sunak decided to go in July is because you might have had people doing things like this, moving to Labour, moving to Reform, all the way through the summer. And so he got more control of these circumstances. Lucy Allen had a little bit less time to do this. I guess it must represent her politics, and, well, good luck to her.
Gracious of you, Danny. Yeah, well, there we are. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was Michael Gove. Now, Polly, I seem to remember you came on the Times radio show that the last time Michael Gove announced he was going to stand down as an MP. And then he staged a miraculous comeback.
Yes, it's a way to alienate most of my friends, really. But I have a soft spot for Michael Gove. As a minister with whom I have often disagreed on lots of specifics, but somebody who has brought rigour and ambition and thoughtfulness, and also actually a desire to listen to, learn from and engage with people from outside his sort of core political tribe that I think has been rarely seen within the last years since 2015. He is, of course, controversial in loads of ways, but there are very few ministers who every single time they arrived in a department spent some time actually getting to grips intellectually with the challenges that face them, genuinely made strategic decisions about what to prioritise and drove through an agenda for change. And to have done that time after time, department after department, I really, really wish that Michael Gove was not the kind of high watermark of ministerialness. If he was the low watermark, what an extraordinary government we would have. So disagree with him if you like, of course, but I think that we should aspire to have that quality of thoughtfulness and leadership in all of our ministers.
I think that Michael Gove's contribution to the Brexit campaign was a low watermark for him. It was a baleful, woeful contribution to our national well-being. But I do have to admit that we are friends. And some time ago, we arranged to have dinner together in June. When the election was called, I assumed the dinner would not happen. But with his departure from Surrey Heath, we've now confirmed that we are indeed going to have dinner during the course of this campaign.
Well, that's the main thing. Oh, thank goodness for that.
Thank God the dinner's saved. Thank God.
He's never bought me dinner.
I do think that's interesting because I think Michael is somebody who does talk to people who he doesn't necessarily agree with, as does Peter. That is valuable. You learn lots of things from each other, and it doesn't involve Peter having to agree with Michael or the other way round. I agree with Polly. I think Michael is very impressive because he's focused. Actually, indeed, during the Brexit referendum, I couldn't have disagreed with him more passionately, but I did think he made serious arguments for it, even including the one where which he's pilloried about, where he talked about experts. Even that was a serious argument, actually. And I think he often says things where you're thinking, well, do I agree with that? Do I not? Let's have a discussion about that. But it rarely falls below the level where it needs to be discussed. And I've throughout my whole political life, I've had disagreements with him. I disagree with him about when he was a columnist about the Irish peace process. But I think he's very impressive intellectually, and also he's somebody whom you can exchange with cordially. And I like Peter, he's a friend of mine. So I was sorry that he stood down, but I think he's had a very distinguished political career.
Oh, that's nice. A nice outbreak of cross-party. No doubt some will describe cosy consensus. In a moment, I want to ask you for your predictions of what you think might just happen before we meet again in the next week of the campaign. Right, before we round off then, your predictions for the next week. What is a likely thing to play out in the next week or so? Will we see a Keir Starmer policy? Will Ed Davey point down a toilet? Will Rishi Sunak get drenched in the rain again? What do you think will happen in the next week, Polly?
There will be, new policy announcements which will fall apart over the course of a media cycle. My prediction will be somebody doing something really stupid with numbers, like pretending that police officers cost £10 or something. I strongly predict something that will get torn to shreds on More or Less on the BBC, which is my second favourite podcast.
Somebody's numbers not adding up. Peter,
Yes.
Your prediction?
My prediction is that it's the economy stupid, and that today you will hear the Rachel Reeves economic sequel to the Keir Starmer political sequel of yesterday, and that she will set out her economic thesis, and that is going to be the running sort of fundamental issue, subject, policy on which the election will be decided at the end of the day.
Very good. A serious prediction from Peter. Danny?
Very serious.
We'll have a lot of discussion about candidates. There'll be a big controversy about Diane Abbott and whether she can be a candidate. It'll become there'll be Tory associations who will be furious at the shortlist being too small for them. Labour will have a similar problem, but it'll be more disciplined about it because they think they're going to win, so people will be less annoyed about it. Reform candidates will either fall short of the numbers or begin to look eccentric, or both. So that'll be a big issue. And then I think it's also possible at some point, and maybe it'll take place over next week, it'll begin to become apparent that Jeremy Corbyn could win in Islington North, and that will therefore create itself a little bit of a story. None of those, by the way, are general election overall result moving stories, but they'll all take place over next week.
But none of it matters, Danny. Perfect. What a perfect note to end on. As ever, thank you so much. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us howtowin@thetimes.co.uk or send us a voice note 0333 003 2353. But put how to win in your message so that we can find it. We'll be back again very soon talking about the general election, talking about how to win election with Daniel Finkelstein, Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie and me, Matt Chorley. That was How to Win an Election.